November 8th, 1942, Sidi Ferrach Beach, Algeria. The first American infantry waded ashore in North Africa carrying a weapon most of them had never fired. Packed in crates stamped secret were 5,000 M1 rocket launchers, soon to be nicknamed bazookas, after a comedian's homemade horn. Within 18 months, this steel tube, costing roughly $25 to build, would force a complete rewrite of German armoured doctrine, spawn a hurried German imitation, and become one of the most widely copied weapons of the 20th century. This is the story of how a piece of scrap pipe and a bent coat hanger helped turn American infantry from tank victims into tank hunters, and why an army that already had far more sophisticated anti-tank guns on the drawing board decided that what it really needed was something almost embarrassingly simple. The problem before the bazooka. To understand why the bazooka mattered, it helps to understand what infantry had before it. Through the interwar years and into the first years of World War II, an infantryman facing a tank had grim options. Anti-tank rifles, large, heavy, single-shot weapons firing a full-caliber bullet, had been adequate against the thin-skinned tanks of the 1930s, but were already struggling against the thicker armour of German medium tanks by 1940. Anti-tank grenades required a soldier to get close enough to throw one, often within a tank's own field of fire. Molotov cocktails, improvised from bottles and gasoline, were a measure of last resort more than a real doctrine. Anti-tank guns, towed weapons like the 37mm, were far more effective, but they were also heavy, slow to reposition, and needed a trained crew and a truck or team of men to move them. They worked well from a fixed position. They were far less useful to infantry advancing on foot through broken terrain. What the army wanted, at least on paper, was something like the British Piat or the German Panzerfaust concept, but nobody in the US had quite landed on a workable design. The pieces existed independently. Rocket researchers had experimented with recoilless propulsion for years, and the Army's Ordnance Department had a promising new anti-tank rocket, a shaped charge design that needed a proper launch tube. What it didn't have was somebody to put the two ideas together in front of the right generals at the right moment, an improvised beginning. That moment came on May 6th, 1942, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Army Ordnance had scheduled a demonstration of anti-tank weapons, chiefly a heavy, British-designed spigot mortar that needed a trained crew and careful setup to operate. Colonel Leslie Skinner's small rocket research team, including Lieutenant Edward Ohl, had been quietly working on that shape charge rocket in parallel. It worked well enough on its own, but it had no proper launcher. It was still essentially being fired off improvised rails. According to accounts later preserved by the Army, Ohl scrounged a length of steel tubing from a scrap pile that happened to be close to the right diameter and bent a wire coat hanger into crude sights. The whole assembly reportedly came together the morning of the test. The scheduled weapons went first. Fired at a moving M3 Stuart tank from around 150 yards, the spigot mortars failed to score a single hit. The crew struggled with the weight, the awkward sighting systems, and the difficulty of tracking a moving target quickly. Then Ohl stepped up with the improvised tube. He is said to have worn a welder's mask for the first shot, uncertain whether there would be dangerous backblast. There wasn't. He shouldered the tube, lined up the coat hanger sights, and fired. The rocket struck the tank's side. He reloaded within seconds and hit it again. Major General Gladian Barnes, the Army's Chief of Research and Engineering, is said to have taken one look at the crude tube and remarked that it resembled Bob Burns's bazooka, the joke musical instrument played by the popular radio comedian of the same name, itself cobbled together from gas pipe and a funnel. The nickname stuck immediately, in the way nicknames do when they're funnier and more memorable than whatever the weapon was officially supposed to be called. Barnes reportedly ordered thousands of units on the spot. What followed was one of the fastest weapons development timelines of the war. By October 1942, 5 months after that improvised demonstration, General Electric and other contractors were turning out roughly 5,000 bazookas a month. Going from a scrap pile prototype to steady mass production in under half a year was almost unheard of for a piece of military hardware, and it says as much about the weapon's simplicity as it does about wartime urgency. There was very little to engineer around. A steel tube, some basic wiring, a stamped metal shoulder stock, and a rocket that could be built largely on existing small arms production lines. Simple by design. The M1 was a 54-inch tube, 2.36 inches in diameter, weighing about 13 pounds, light enough for one man to carry and fire alone, though it worked best as a two-man team, one to aim and fire, one to load and watch for threats. It fired electrically, using two dry-cell batteries housed in the shoulder stock, with the rocket loaded from the rear and a wire connecting it to the ignition circuit. Its rocket could punch through roughly 3 to 4 inches of armour, at ranges up to about 300 yards, enough to defeat the side and rear armour of most tanks it would encounter, if it hit a vulnerable spot. It wasn't going to shrug off a glancing blow the way an anti-tank shell might. Shaped charge weapons depend on a clean hit and the right angle, which is part of why so many of the war's famous bazooka kills involved gunners getting in close and picking their shot rather than firing from maximum range. What made the weapon revolutionary, though, wasn't really the physics. Plenty of countries had shaped charge warheads. It was the training curve. A soldier with no prior experience could be taught to load, aim, and fire a bazooka effectively in a single afternoon. An anti-tank gun crew needed weeks of training to become proficient, and even then, the gun couldn't go where the infantry went. 2 men with a bazooka could climb a hill, cross a hedgerow, or clear a building alongside a rifle squad. That portability, more than the armour penetration figures, is what changed infantry tactics. A rough combat debut Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, put the bazooka into combat for the first time on the very day it went ashore. The debut nearly went badly. The weapons had shipped in sealed crates marked secret, with strict orders not to open them until the operation began and no training materials included. By several accounts, General Eisenhower only learned the night before the landings that the troops carrying these new weapons had never actually fired one. Soldiers were left to work out the loading and firing sequence essentially under fire, on the beach, with no rehearsal. Compounding the problem, a number of rockets had absorbed moisture during the Atlantic crossing, and misfires and duds were common in the earliest engagements. By some unit accounts, a sizable fraction of the first rockets fired failed to function properly. Even so, some units improvised effectively almost immediately. Armoured elements operating near Port Lyautey reportedly used bazookas to knock out French Renault tanks, defending Vichy positions within the first days of the campaign, a small but telling sign of what the weapon could do once soldiers got the hang of it. Moisture damage and all. The Germans take notice. At the Kasserine Pass in mid-February 1943, elements of Rommel's Afrika Korps overran American positions and captured substantial equipment from the retreating US Second Corps, including several intact bazookas and a stock of rockets. These were shipped back to Germany for analysis at the Kummersdorf Weapons Testing Facility. German engineers who examined the captured weapons were struck less by its power than by how little it took to build one. Where their own anti-tank rocket concepts tended toward heavier, more powerful, more mechanically involved designs, here was something any factory with basic welding equipment could turn out. The assessment, in essence, was grudging respect. Crude, but clever, and worryingly easy to mass-produce. Germany moved quickly to develop an answer. Engineers enlarged the warhead diameter from the bazooka's 60mm to a much more powerful 88mm, married it to a similar tube and electrical ignition concept, and by mid-1943 had the Raketenpanzerbuchse, the Panzerschreck, literally tank's fright, in production. It was, shot for shot, a more powerful weapon than the American original, capable of penetrating significantly thicker armour. But it was also heavier, needed a 2-man crew wearing protective gear against its fiercer backblast, and was considerably more labour-intensive to manufacture. Over the course of the war, Germany built roughly 289,000 Panzerschrecks, an impressive number for a country under increasing Allied bombing, but still well short of American bazooka production, which would eventually exceed 400,000 launchers and outpace German output by a wide margin, even before counting the millions of rockets built to feed them. Sicily and Italy, the weapon matures. By the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, American forces carried an improved model, with sturdier tubes and more reliable electrical contacts, paired with an upgraded rocket. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne reportedly scored a remarkable hit on a Tiger tank near Biscari, striking through the driver's vision port, one of the few genuinely vulnerable points on an otherwise heavily armoured vehicle. It was exceptional marksmanship rather than a typical engagement, but stories like it spread quickly through the ranks and did as much for morale as any training manual could. German units began adapting almost immediately. First-hand accounts from the period describe a growing wariness about sending tanks into towns without infantry screening ahead of them. A tank commander who didn't know what was waiting behind a shuttered window or a stone wall was taking a real risk with the new American weapon in the enemy's hands. That caution deepened through the fall and winter of the Italian campaign. In the tangle of medieval hill towns along the peninsula, bazooka teams developed what troops nicknamed mouse-holing, blasting passages through the walls between adjoining buildings rather than exposing themselves to fire crossing the streets outside. Canadian units fighting through the ruins of Ortona that December found the tactic and the weapon behind it invaluable against fortified houses that would otherwise have taken heavy infantry casualties to clear room by room. By January 1944, American production had climbed to around 20,000 units a month, and an improved two-piece model had entered service, with magneto-ignition that did away with the failure-prone dry cell batteries entirely. Bazookas were no longer a battlefield novelty. A typical infantry battalion by this point carried 2 to 3 dozen of them as standard-issue equipment, roughly on par with the battalion's machine guns in terms of how routine they'd become, forcing a German doctrine change. The spread of the bazooka forced real, documented changes in how German armour operated in the field. Wehrmacht guidance from this period increasingly emphasised clearing buildings before advancing tanks into built-up areas, maintaining distance from unscoured structures, and fitting vehicles with anti-shaped charge skirt armour, known as Schürzen. Thin steel plates hung off the sides of tanks specifically to detonate shaped charge warheads before they could reach the main armour. The Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste applied to German armour from late 1943 onward, though primarily meant to defeat magnetic anti-tank mines, reflected a broader defensive posture shaped in part by the growing prevalence of infantry-carried shaped charges of all kinds, bazookas included. German officers writing after the war, including Heinz Guderian, one of the principal architects of Blitzkrieg doctrine, acknowledged in their memoirs that the proliferation of infantry anti-tank weapons like the bazooka undercut the fast, independent armoured thrust that had won Germany's early victories in Poland and France. Armour now needed constant infantry protection to survive in close terrain, which meant slower advances, more caution, and less of the shock-and-speed tactics the Wehrmacht had built its reputation on. Normandy and the hedgerows. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, bazooka teams were standard in every American infantry unit going ashore, now carrying an improved model with an optical sight for better accuracy at range. The Normandy hedgerows, thick centuries-old earthen embankments topped with dense brush, dividing the countryside into a maze of small fields, turned out to be close to ideal bazooka country. Sightlines were short, cover was everywhere, and a tank pushing through a gap in the hedgerow often couldn't see far enough ahead to spot an ambush before it was already in range. One of the war's most unusual bazooka stories belongs to Major Charles Carpenter of the 4th Armoured Division. An artillery liaison pilot, Carpenter had 6 bazookas mounted on the wing struts of his small unarmed L-4 Grasshopper observation plane and used the improvised gunship to attack German armour from the air over the following months, earning the nickname Bazooka Charlie and a Silver Star for his trouble. His restored aircraft, mounting brackets and all, was rediscovered decades later in an Austrian museum and remains on display as one of the odder footnotes of the European campaign. Winter brought its own set of problems. During the Battle of the Bulge that December, extreme cold caused battery failures in older models still lingering in service, and soldiers found that rocket propellant burned differently, and less predictably, at sub-zero temperatures. Troops took to warming batteries and even rockets inside their coats before use, a small but telling adaptation to conditions the weapon was never designed for. Even so, bazooka teams accounted for a substantial share of German armour losses during the battle, including, by several soldiers' post-war accounts, Panther tanks caught from the flank or rear at short range in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. Beyond Europe, the Pacific and Korea bazookas also saw extensive, if less publicised, use in the Pacific Theatre, where Marines found them effective against Japanese light and medium tanks, and just as importantly, against the fortified bunkers and cave complexes that defined so much of the island fighting. White phosphorus rockets, originally intended as an incendiary anti-vehicle round, became a particularly valued tool for clearing entrenched positions on islands like Saipan and later Iwo Jima, where a conventional assault often meant unacceptable casualties. The weapon's story didn't end with World War II. When the Korean War began in the summer of 1950, American troops discovered that their existing bazookas were no longer up to the task. Soviet-built T-34/85 tanks fielded by North Korean forces had armor that the older rockets simply couldn't reliably defeat, and early combat reports described bazooka rounds bouncing off or failing to penetrate at ranges that would have been lethal against a wartime Panzer. It was a sobering reminder that the weapon's effectiveness had always been relative to the armor it was up against. The Army's response was fast by any standard. Within months, a larger 3.5-inch rocket and matching launcher, quickly nicknamed the Super Bazooka, was rushed into production and shipped to Korea, restoring almost overnight an infantry weapon that could reliably stop the newer Soviet tanks. It was, in its own smaller way, a repeat of the original 1942 story, a fast, practical response to an urgent battlefield problem, favouring speed of deployment over drawn-out development. The view from inside a tank. It's worth pausing on what the bazooka actually did to the experience of fighting in an armoured vehicle, because the tactical shift is easier to understand from that side of the armour plate. A tank crew in 1940 or 1941 operated with a certain confidence. Infantry without effective anti-tank weapons could be driven off, run over, or simply ignored, while the tank pressed forward with the rest of the armoured spearhead. Buildings, hedgerows and tree lines were terrain features, not threats. By 1944, the calculus had changed. Every hedgerow gap, every shattered doorway, every stretch of rubble was a place a two-man team might be waiting. With a weapon that, at close range, could kill even a heavy tank from an angle the crew might never see coming, commanders increasingly had to weigh the risk of pushing armour into unscouted terrain against the time cost of waiting for infantry to clear it first, and in an army whose entire early success had depended on speed, that hesitation was itself a kind of victory for the other side. This is really the heart of the bazooka's contribution to the Allied war effort. Not any single spectacular tank kill, but a slow, grinding erosion of German armour's freedom of movement, multiplied across thousands of small unit actions from North Africa to the Rhine. Why it worked. Compared to other anti-tank weapons of the era, Britain's PIAT, with its awkward spring-loaded firing mechanism and limited range, the Soviet PTRD anti-tank rifle, heavy and increasingly outmatched by later German armour, Germany's own disposable single-shot Panzerfaust, powerful but usable only at very short range and only once, the bazooka struck an unusual balance. It was reasonably light, fully reusable, effective at genuinely useful combat ranges, and above all simple enough to build and simple enough to teach that it could be handed to essentially any infantryman on short notice. None of its wartime rivals matched all of those qualities at once. That simplicity carried a cost-effectiveness that's easy to understate. Knocking out a single tank using another tank, or using towed anti-tank guns or using aircraft, generally meant risking, and often losing, equipment and trained crews worth many tens of thousands of dollars. A bazooka rocket, by contrast, cost only a few dollars, and the launcher itself only slightly more than that. The weapon didn't need to win every single engagement to be worth its price many times over. It just needed to make a German tank commander think twice before pushing into a town, a hedgerow, or a stretch of forest without infantry screening. And that hesitation, multiplied across thousands of engagements, mattered as much as any individual kill. By the war's end, American factories had built well over 400,000 launchers and millions of rockets, spread across dozens of subcontractors in more than 30 states, a distributed production network that no single bombing raid or act of sabotage could meaningfully disrupt. Germany's more sophisticated Panzerschreck, built in more concentrated facilities and requiring more skilled labour per unit, never came close to matching that scale, even as it remained the more powerful weapon on paper. Legacy. The bazooka's real achievement was never really about its armour penetration figures. It was proof of a broader, distinctly American industrial idea, that a cheap, simple weapon, built by the thousands and put into the hands of ordinary soldiers after only a few hours of instruction, could blunt the advantage of a technically superior enemy. Germany entered the war fielding the most feared armoured forces on the planet, built around the doctrine of fast, independent, shock-driven breakthroughs. By 1944, those same tanks were creeping cautiously through hedgerows and rubble-strewn towns, wary of the ordinary infantryman who might be waiting around the next corner with a tube on their shoulder. Its descendants are still standard issue today, in one form or another, in armies around the world. The American M72 Law, Sweden's Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, the Soviet-designed RPG series that armed dozens of nations during the Cold War and beyond. Every one of them traces its lineage back to a length of scrap pipe and a bent coat hanger, tested almost as an afterthought on a Maryland proving ground on a spring morning in 1942, and to the two army officers who looked at a failed demonstration of far more sophisticated weapons and decided that what worked was worth more than what looked impressive on paper.